Okay, folks, I've got 5 minutes, and what I want to talk to you about this morning is about ways of progressives being able to reassert themselves into the economic debate. At the moment, winning the battle of ideas requires reframing the debate and reframing the way that we think about markets and about economics. Free markets and their outcomes are characterised as efficient and meritocratic. This leaves progressives having to make the case for taking away wealth that's been secured on the basis of merit and efficiency and to redistribute it on the basis of some ideal of equality. It's a very hard argument to win. I think we need to take a lesson from the neoliberals. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, I want to recount a story told by S.M. Amade in a fabulous book called Rationalising Capitalist Democracy. Amade talks about how neoliberalism remade our understanding of democracy to win the Cold War battle of ideas. In simple terms, the argument is that in the 1940s, democracy was strongly associated with socialism. It was understood as the collective deliberation on the common good and was seen as a natural political parallel of socialism as an economic system focused on the collective production for the common good. As democracy became popular after World War I and proved itself to be very effective in practice, neoliberals were despairing. They saw the rise of democracy would lead to the rise of the welfare state and what they saw as socialism. However, in response to this despair, in the 1950s and 60s, classical liberals, nurtured by organisations like the Mont Pelerin School, laid the political groundwork for a resurgence as they set about reinterpreting democracy. Having accepted the empirical evidence that democracy worked well and it was popular, they began coming up with alternative explanations for why it functioned well. We saw Anthony Downs' economic theory of democracy in the 1950s, James Buchanan's calculus of consent in the 1960s, and Robert Riker's politics of coalitions in the 70s. By the 1970s, new accounts of democracy were coming to the fore, which saw its strengths as its ability to mediate between competing interests. Democracy was increasingly painted as being a market-like mechanism that managed competing interests productively. Voters became consumers and their votes were consumption choices. In the late 1970s, Amade argues, for the first time it began to be argued that there was a natural affinity between democracy and free markets. In taking something that worked well and coming up with an alternate explanation for its strengths, the neoliberals were able to take ownership of its good performance. They were able to take ownership of the biggest and most successful idea of the century. They were then also able to begin to regulate democracy in accordance with their values. This recharacterisation of democracy was seminal to the rise of the small government movement, which argued that democracy was about managing competing interests, and to prevent these interests distorting things too much, government should be kept small. Similarly, it was the framework that allowed equality seekers such as unions, feminists, anti-racist campaigners, etc., to all be labelled as special interest groups. They took something that was working, they reimagined it in their own image, not only enabling them to own its strengths, they were then able to reform it to fit that image. So I think this is a powerful example that progressives need to take in the way that we think about markets. The great challenge for progressives, and the challenge I want to put out here today, is we need to do similar things to our understandings of the market. After 150 years of progressives putting all their intellectual energy into critiquing markets, we need to change tack. Markets have demonstrated themselves to be the most effective way of creating wealth. We need to start coming up with creative and new ways of making sense of that success and how we can better harness it to deliver wealth and opportunity for all people. The creative space to do this is the yawning gap between economic theory and economic realities. That gap is the opportunity for progressives to come in and develop more empirically compelling and realistic accounts of how markets work, what their strengths are, and what their shortcomings are that need to be ameliorated. So what I want to present very briefly here is my first suggestion of what an alternate account of the markets could possibly be. Okay, what I want to do is return to Adam Smith and the neglected other half of The Wealth of Nations, and Smith's explanation of the source of economic growth. Smith argued that economic growth is a product of the increasing division of labour. He argues it's the product of a process of specialisation and trade. The basic story is that if you think back to subsistence farmers, they grew their own food, built their own homes, sewed their own clothes. They were jacks of all trades and master of none, and it delivered a very low standard of living. The next level of development saw a greater division of labour and trading. You start to have bakers and cobblers and blacksmiths and tinkers. The division of labour enabled people to specialise in a task. Developing specialised skills and tools, they became more productive and were then able to trade their more valuable product with others. The process of industrialisation created a division of labour when we think about early factories, with more intense specialisation and longer production chains, and they became even more productive. In the modern world, we have production chains made up of thousands of people that stretch around the globe. The example I give to my students is to get them to reflect on how many people have had a hand in making their pen. Think about the geologists, the mine engineers, the miners, the people that created the mining equipment and the trucks, the trains, the crane handlers, the ports, the smelters, who built the smelters, the accounts and HR and admin people that make all of that work, the transporting it to where it would be smelted down to make just the nib of your pen. And then you've got to go through the same processes with the plastics and the inks, and then the process of getting it distributed to our local newsagents. And it's the product of having thousands and thousands of people doing their tiny part in this very long production chain that enables us to have a pen of this quality for 70 cents. So the modern economy, the efficiency of it comes from specialisation and trade, and it's characterised by these very long production chains. When we think about the economy this way, it creates a number of opportunities for a progressive perspective. Firstly, in this approach, wealth and efficiency is a product of gains from cooperation. Wealth is coming from effective specialisation and trade. The conditions for economic success are the conditions that enable very long production chains to function effectively. It's built on the social conditions in which people can cooperate with strangers. As a result, it makes sense that the world's wealthiest societies have high levels of trust, high levels of law-abidingness, high social cohesion, and strong justice systems. Thinking about strong economies in terms of well-functioning production chains opens up a whole range of different ways of thinking about our economy. But our focus today in this panel is on equality, so I want to talk about how it opens up our thinking about economic equality. In this way of thinking about the economy, there are two ways that you can seek to increase your profitability. One is to find more productive ways of doing things that create more value. So you can find new forms of specialisation and trade, you can find new technology, new skills, which enables you to produce more value than you were able to produce before. The other way to increase your profits is to redistribute wealth along the production chain. So, for example, we've had recent examples with the public outcry about the big supermarkets' treatments of farmers and the supermarkets' expansion of their profits by pushing down the prices they're paying to farmers, that this increases their profits, but they haven't created any more value. They've just shifted the resources along the production chain. We could similarly look at things like whether or not labour market flexibility really creates more gains from cooperation and more value, or whether it's just cost-shifting risk from employers onto their employees. So thinking about the economy in terms of these long production chains enables us to draw a conceptual distinction between socially productive profits and exploitative profits, where socially productive profits find ways to create more value and exploitative profits are gained just by shifting resources up and down the production chain. A second opportunity that arises from this approach is that it allows us to analyse production chains in new ways. It enables us to reintegrate economics with the other social sciences as we look at the relationships between different links in the chain. Relations between links in the chain will be driven by a variety of things. We've got the traditional supply and demand from conventional economics. We can hold on to that and still use it. But we can also look at issues of power, of identity, like race or gender or social status or professional status. We can look at cultural norms and history and government regulation and the way that all of these factors impact on the way that the chains function. If you'd like to know more, you can check out my book, How to Argue with an Economist, to learn more about the values commitments that are embedded in mainstream economics and why progressives cannot just accept economics as a value-neutral tool. If you're interested in what the rest of the social sciences have to say about other factors that impact on the power dynamics between links in the chain, check out my recent book, The Passion of Politics. The book introduces the big political theories about these issues in an exciting and accessible way. You can also check out my website, lindyedwards.com.